previously talked of his admiration of Putin. He did actually try to dial it back because he said that he didn't like him as a person, but admired him as a political operator, given the control that he was able to exert Putin as is over Russia. Putin, of course, it runs a sort of, it's not quite a, it claims to be a democracy. There are elections, but it's a fairly authoritarian regime that he runs in Russia. And I think there's a danger that Farage has overplayed his hand with this, isn't there? Because if you think back to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you think back to the widespread public support that we offered. 247,000 Ukrainians came to this country to seek refuge. And I think what's interesting is that both Labour and the Tories, having previously tried to ignore Farage, have actually gone on seen this as an opportune moment to attack Nigel Farage for what James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, described as his vile views when it comes to Putin's Russia.
What do you think it tells us that the Conservatives are putting up a candidate rather than a government minister this morning? Because that's what you usually expect when we are offered people to come on from the Conservatives or the Labour or the Lib Dems. That's who you would normally get. What would you read into that?
So what usually happens is that somebody in this case it'd be in CCHQ would go down the list and they'd think who's a good media performer, who can manage a broadcast interview without dropping a clanger or potentially letting their own beliefs slip, because what you don't want is somebody coming out and say, well, actually, I think Rishi Sunak was wrong on this or wrong on that. And you go down the list, and that narrows it down. And then it's simply a case of trying to book them in and persuade them to do it. And I'd imagine that on a Saturday morning, they weren't, given the state of affairs that the Conservative Party currently finds itself in, according to the polls, nobody fancied it. And so they had to cast their net a little wider. But I don't think they did a particularly bad job. And I don't think Mr. Simmons did either, just in terms of the answers that he provided.
Yeah, really interesting. Let's talk about at the front of the Times today. J.K. Rowling has been speaking exclusively to the Times, saying Labour has turned its back on women. Just wonder, she's very critical, quite personal attack on Sir Keir Starmer, saying there wasn't enough support for Rosie Duffield when she was talking about her views, which differed from Keir Starmer on trans rights. How much of a headache is this potentially for Labour, or not, when we're in the middle of a general election campaign?
I think it's significant. I don't think Labour HQ will be waking up, the leader's office will be waking up this morning and thinking this is something that they can just sort of brush away. It's a significant intervention. I think you're right to point out to the fact that it's quite a personal attack on Sir Keir Starmer, the leader. She describes it, she says she has a poor opinion of the Labour leader, the Harry Potter author, saying that he's often taken a dismissive and often offensive approach to concerns from the feminist caucus, who, of course, are very worried about what Keir Starmer has said previously when it comes to the rights of women, against juxtaposed against the rights of those who have had gender reassignment and would like to be and have changed their legal documentation so that they can so that they are women, and in the legal documentation that they have changed. So I think there is there's already been a shift of approach, though, from the Starmer. He knows there's a problem with it, because he did say that he agreed with Tony Blair, the former Labour Prime Minister, this week in a broadcast interview, and Tony Blair had spoken about the fact that biologically at birth, a woman is somebody who has a vagina, not a penis. And of course, Keir Starmer, when you go all the way back a couple of years now to that interview where he said he couldn't answer the question whether a woman can have a penis or not. So there is a recognition of a problem, and I think he's tried to address it. But this intervention from J.K. Rowling means that the issue doesn't go away.
Nigel Farage did an interview, a leaders' interview last night, where, well, he's upset a lot of people by saying the West provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What more did he say?
Yeah, I think this is significant, and I think, of course, he's previously said it, and he's previously talked of his admiration of Putin. He did actually try to dial it back because he said that he didn't like him as a person, but admired him as a political operator, given the control that he was able to exert Putin as is over Russia. Putin, of course, it runs a sort of, it's not quite a, it claims to be a democracy. There are elections, but it's a fairly authoritarian regime that he runs in Russia. And I think there's a danger that Farage has overplayed his hand with this, isn't there? Because if you think back to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you think back to the widespread public support that we offered. 247,000 Ukrainians came to this country to seek refuge. And I think what's interesting is that both Labour and the Tories, having previously tried to ignore Farage, have actually gone on seen this as an opportune moment to attack Nigel Farage for what James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, described as his vile views when it comes to Putin's Russia. And I think there is also, if Nigel Farage is taking this stance, is he trying to appeal? It doesn't sit with trying to appeal to well-meaning Conservative voters or well-meaning Labour voters. It sits with trying to appeal to cranks who think that somehow Vladimir Putin is just misunderstood and was perfectly justified in what he did in Ukraine. We're talking about a country now that's been under bombardment. Ukraine, a sovereign country that's been under bombardment constantly from Russia now for more than 2 years. So I think Farage, rather than actually trying to undergo some sort of Damascene conversion where he admits that he was wrong and trying to broaden his appeal, has actually sort of narrowed it in, and I think that might end up potentially costing him in the next couple of weeks.
Finally and briefly, let's talk about non-DOMs leaving the UK. It's the front of the FT weekend. They're saying that wealth creators are leaving. We know, of course, Labour and the Conservatives both clamping down on non-DOM tax status. I'm just wondering where that leaves Labour and Conservative, plans to try and raise billions in extra taxes, and in Labour case for paying for things like free breakfast clubs in schools, more hospital and dental appointments. That is going to be a challenge, isn't it?
I think the bit of context that Callum provided is really important, in that this shouldn't be seen as a flight from a Labour government. This data goes back now a few years. Interestingly, I was reporting on your CEO summit earlier this week. It was Thursday this week, and it was perhaps no surprises to see that Rachel Reeves, the Labour Shadow Chancellor, actually got just as warm reception from the captains of industry. I mean, he has some big names there, and just as warm a reception as Jeremy Hunt, the top of British industry, clearly going. There were a couple of noises off about Labour's net zero plans, but generally speaking, the captains of industry were very happy with Rachel Reeves' plans for business and for economic growth. But you're quite right to point out that if the wealth creators, those people who invest, who want to come into this country, build factories, set up their business, and put millions in, feel that they can't do so without potentially putting their other wealth into a pot to be taxed by the British government, then they're less likely to do so. What was also interesting, and there's been a slight change, hasn't there, with the manifesto, is that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer don't want to go straight after non-DOMs. What they want to do is they want to actually pinpoint to stop the system being used as a way to avoid tax if you are actually living in this, if you are living and working in this country. What they don't want to do, given their plans for economic growth, is to create a blanket system where very, very high net worth individuals who will invest in this country suddenly decide not to, because they'll face a much higher rate of tax.
Yeah. Theo, good to speak to you. Thank you. That is political correspondent Theo Usherwood.